Good afternoon again. I want to thank everybody for attending. Uh, Reverend Ward, could you give us an opening prayer, please? Thank you, sir. Normally, this is at the end of an article. Disclaimer. I am not a Black history scholar, but I am a Black history and a history enthusiast. And I promise you that what I'm going to present to you today has been researched by Black history scholars. I also want to thank Pastor Billups and the youth ministry for allowing me this opportunity. And while I'm at it, I have nothing but admiration and respect for our youth ministry and our youth ministry directors. I think they do a fantastic job with our youth, and I know that has to take special talent and skill. So I appreciate it, and I want to recognize them for what they do. Several years ago, I started researching the history of my family, as Pastor Billups and Pastor Frederick has mentioned a couple of times. And I found a tremendous amount of information about my family. And I want to tell you right now, if you haven't done it, you need to do it, because it's intriguing and it is rewarding to find out about your ancestors. It'll tell you, it'll give you a better idea of who you really are as a person. And when you learn about these people who lived 100 years ago or more, it'll also let you know whose you are. But anyway, in doing that, I found out a lot about our race and slavery in particular. And that was intriguing to me. And there's a lot of stuff that I found out that I didn't know. I thought I knew a lot, or I thought I knew quite a bit about slavery, but I didn't. And so I want to share that with you today, because I think that that history is the story of most, if not all, of our early ancestors' lives. This is going to be a highly condensed version, to say the least. There's no way you can tell the story about slavery and our early ancestors in an hour. Just no way. You're talking volumes. You're talking several hours of information. Also, I believe that what happens in the past directly determines what happens in the future. Therefore, it's important that we understand the past. Now, I had to keep something in mind as I was researching and reading about man's inhumanity to man. One is that there's a purpose in everything that God allows. There's a purpose in everything that he allows. Something that came to my mind also when I was doing that was something that was in one of our men's ministry Bible study books. It was called The Doctrine of Meticulous Providence, or the Greater Good Doctrine. That doctrine states that God will allow no evil except that evil which prevents a greater evil, or that brings about a greater good. God will allow no evil except that evil that would prevent a greater evil, or that would bring about a greater good. As I told you today, jot down any questions or comments you might have so that we don't have to interrupt the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, we'll address those questions or comments. Slavery in various forms is an institution that has been a part of the culture of most groups of people for thousands of years, long before the enslavement of Africans in America. Slavery was rarely viewed as unjust or evil, rarely viewed. Many societies justified the enslavement of certain groups on race, religion, or ethnicity. A person could become enslaved for various reasons: as a captive in a war or a conflict, to pay off a debt, as punishment, as was in the case with the Israelites a lot of times, or as a free source of labor. Those who became enslaved to pay off a debt or as punishment could be freed once those things were satisfied. The beginning of the horrible journey of Africans to Americans began with the Portuguese slave trade. Brian, do you have that outline you put up? There we go. Part one, the Portuguese slave trade. That's where it began. Subtitle of that is going to be the role of Africa and the church. Two of the least likely entities that you would think would be involved in the slave trade. Africa, like most other societies, was in the slaveholding and trading business long before she started trading her people to the Europeans for shipment across the Atlantic. The Arabs were the primary traders on the East Coast early on. During the 1300s, in some of the western countries of Africa, including Ghana, nearly 1/3 of the population was enslaved by its own people. Although most Africans lived under primitive tribal conditions, many highly developed kingdoms existed in Africa during this period. The Mali Empire was one. It reigned for 300 years and covered most of the northern part of Africa. It was a center of culture and trade. Between 1200 and 1600, a Negro Asiatic university called Sankaree, Sankoree, flourished at Timbuktu. Yes, there is a place called Timbuktu. It was also part of the Mali Empire. Sankaree means enlightened nobles. It boasted of having 25,000 students at one time. Scholars differ in their opinions on why Africa so willingly traded its people to the Europeans as slaves. Some attribute it to a lack of racial identity and unity. Now, that lack of racial unity is not noted as much in Asian, European, or other ethnic groups. That flaw, if you will, was exploited in the enslavement of the African, and is still used against the American of African descent today. Although the sub-Saharan Africans are of the same race, Africa is a vast continent with many countries, cultures, and tribal groups. There are 3,000 different tribes or ethnic groups in Africa. They were then, and even today, constantly in conflict with each other over ethnic and cultural differences. got that going on in the Congo as I speak. The Portuguese were the forerunners of the slave trade that eventually brought African slaves to the Americas. Portugal is a very small country on the Iberian Peninsula of Europe. Brian, you have that map? It is bordered on the east by Spain and on the west by the Atlantic Ocean. Portugal, that little tiny country right there. And of course, this is the continent of Africa. Portuguese sailors were known for their seamanship and had traded along the northwest African coast for many years. In 1441, a young Portuguese ship captain by the name of Anton Goncalves captured 10 Africans and traded them to countries on the Mediterranean. They immediately realized that the slave trade was much more lucrative than trading for spices and started trading for slaves. Catholic Church leaders in Portugal blessed this enterprise by arguing that slavery served as a natural deterrent and Christianizing influence on the barbarous behavior among pagans. Using this logic, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull, Romanus Pontifex, in 1455. The Pope then issued a mandate to Portuguese King Alonso V, a mandate, not a suggestion, and instructed him, and I quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, which was an Islamic group of people in northern Africa, and pagans whatsoever, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. And just like that, millions of Africans were condemned to live and die in the most brutal form of slavery ever known. Though the papal bull mentions invading and vanquishing the African people, no European nation was willing or able to put an army in West Africa until the Portuguese colonized Angola more than a century later. Previous attempts by the Portuguese to acquire African slaves through direct raids had proven ineffective and costly. In 1444, Portuguese marauders arrived in Senegal ready to assault and capture Africans. The Senegalese military strategies and poison arrows decimated the Portuguese soldiers. The Portuguese had long established trading posts all along the West African coast. They would trade metals, cloth, beads, guns, and ammunition for the Africans' more valuable gold, copper, ivory, peppers, wax, grain, and captives. They also built fortified slave castles along and off the coast that served as collection points for the captives until they were loaded onto the slave ships. One of the most infamous was El Mino Castle. Brian, you got that? There you go. That's El Mino. That's the place where once the captives were brought from the interior, they would keep them there, sometimes for months, until a slave ship came and collected them. Many captives would die just from the long journey from the interior to the coast, or they would be murdered along the way if they couldn't keep up. They had to get these people out there quick. And most of the time they were tied together in like a caravan or something like that for several hundred miles. And if they couldn't keep up, one or two couldn't keep up, they just murdered them along the trail. The Portuguese would trade for and ship millions of African slaves to European countries before they started shipping them across the Atlantic to the western colonies. They would dominate the transatlantic slave trade for the first 130 years. Then the British, Dutch, French, and Spanish would engage in the trade eventually, shipping to their colonies in the West Indies and North America. Part 2, the Middle Passage. Got a map of that. Subtitle, Coming to America. This ain't the movie with Arsenio Hall and Eddie Murphy and the Jerry Curl Kid. The Middle Passage is so called because it was the middle leg of the three-leg journey that brought African slaves to the Americas. Brian, you got the map again, please? Here we go. This is Africa, of course. And if you see those red, that's where Africa was shipping slaves to the Arab countries. And this is the Middle Passage, called the Middle Passage right here. These are the different places in Africa. They collected the slaves and they shipped them across the Atlantic to Brazil, to the West Indies, and then to the North American colonies. It's called a Middle Passage because it's actually a three-legged journey. They would start in Europe with supplies that they would bring down to Africa and trade to the African chiefs for the slaves. The second leg, the middle leg, once they did that, then they would transfer them to South America, the West Indies, and the colonies for tobacco, rum, sugar cane, all of the things that they didn't have in Europe. And then they'd go back, and then they would start this cycle all over again. Back to Europe, back to Africa, back to the colonies. The slaves sometimes spent weeks or months waiting in the slave dungeons until a slave ship arrived. Months. The ocean voyage may only take a few weeks, but the overall passage often took months because slave ship captains lengthened the voyage by making stops in various ports, holding areas along the coast, seeking more slaves to fill their cargo bays. The average duration from all regions of Africa was just over 2 months. African slaves would suffer this brutal trip for almost 350 years. Can you imagine being in a slave ship for 2 months on a voyage? Slave ships were specifically designed and built to maximize the number of slaves they could carry. The largest ship was the Parr, P-A-R-R. It was capable of carrying 700 slaves. Another British slave ship, the Brooks, had carried 609 slaves once, and it was only 98 feet long and 27 feet wide. That's not very big. It's, maybe from that wall to that wall, maybe from that wall to there. 609 slaves. If you keep, it's hard to see from this diagram. This is an old diagram, but those are Those dark areas, those are bodies, slaves in the bottom of that ship. 2 layers of them. About 600 and some people crammed in there so tight that they couldn't even move. Laying on like benches or something like that. They couldn't stand up or anything, like sardines in a can. They had to endure that for a couple of months across the Atlantic. Conditions, unless your African ancestors immigrated to America after the importation of slaves was abolished in 1808. In 1808, they passed a law to abolish the slave importation. That meant not coming, you couldn't import them from Africa to the colonies. In other words, unless they immigrated to America after that period, they more than likely came to this country in the belly of that slave ship. Mine, yours, more than likely came here just like that. A slave ship survivor named Aquilano stated, "It was so crowded it almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations so that the air soon became unfit for respiration." Conditions on slave ships were so harsh and unbearable that it has been estimated that between 13 and 19% died in the Middle Passage. Many would die from illnesses caused by the overcrowded, filthy conditions on the ship. You got to imagine laying in that ship like that, defecation, vomit, all sorts of things for 2 months. I'm surprised that 80% of them survived. Some would commit suicide rather than, and go insane. Yeah, from the horrors. And they also recorded cases where some were chained together and thrown overboard to drown when provisions on the ship got too low. The ship captain would just chain a bunch of them up, throw them overboard. Many slave ship captains were professed Christians. Professed Christians. Sir John Hawkins named his ship the Good Ship Jesus. He insisted that his crew serve God daily and love one another. A born-again Christian and minister by the name of John Newton. Everybody heard of John Newton? He was a slaver for many years. But after his second rebirth, he quit the slave trade and wrote the well-known hymn, Amazing Grace. The year 1619 is recognized as the conventional date when slavery began in the American colonies, 1619. Although there were African slaves in the Spanish colony of Florida prior to that date. From 20 and odd to 10 million is an article written by J. David Hacker of Minnesota University. It states that in 1619, a British ship named the White Lion brought a cargo of 20 and odd Africans that it had captured from the Portuguese slave ship San Juan Batista to Hampton, Virginia. They traded them for other goods. His research shows that from these 20 and odd slaves, the population in America grew to 10 million through importation and childbirth by 1860. About 36,000 slave ships are said to have crossed the Middle Passage between 1526 and 1867, a period of 341 years, 36,000 slave ships. 85,000 Africans per year, that's 1,635 per week, were shipped from Africa during the 1790s. 12.5 million men, women, and children were shipped from Africa between 1526 and 1867. 12.5 million. 10.7 million arrived in the Americas. The other 1.8 million perished in the Middle Passage. Africa had become Africa.com and become to the slave trade what Amazon.com is to the retail trade. Now, out of those, how many would you guess were shipped directly to America? How many would you guess out of that 10.7 million people, Africans, shipped to the Americas, how many would you guess were shipped to the North American colony? Anybody? Got a guess? Huh? What? According to researchers, and Henry Louis Gates was one of them, only 388,000. Out of that 10.7 million, only 388,000 were shipped directly to the American colonies. That's not many. The remainder of the total 10 million slaves that lived in America were born in America. That's with an estimated infant mortality rate of 30 to 35%. Newborns, on average, weighed less than 5.5 pounds and were generally weaned at 4 months. They were fed a starch-based diet like gruel, which lacked sufficient nutrients. Half of all infants died in their first year of life. The Portuguese colony of Brazil would receive approximately 5 million of the 10.7 million slaves arriving in the Americas. The remainder would go to Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, Jamaica, and America. Today, Brazil has the largest population of people of African descent, second only to Nigeria, Africa. It is said that the driving force behind the mass importation of Africans to the young colonies of the Western Hemisphere was due to the cultivation of labor-intensive crops, sugarcane and coffee, primarily in the West Indies and Brazil, tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo, and sugarcane in America. Sugarcane was the main product. It is labor intense, and just about every colony grew sugarcane. Once sugar, everybody wanted sugar. Those British people loved it because they could sweeten their tea with it, spot of tea. And you could make a lot of other stuff with use sugar for cooking, making molasses and so forth. So sugarcane was the biggest one, and it was the harshest conditions of all of the labor. The mechanization of the textile industry in England and the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 caused the demand for slave labor in cotton-producing states to triple over the next 50 years. The majority of the slaves coming into America came in through ports in the Carolinas and Georgia. 40% are said to have disembarked at Gaston Wharf in Charleston, South Carolina. The slaves would then be washed down and auctioned off like cattle, oftentimes being subjected to a humiliating inspection of poking and probing of their bodies, especially the females. Now, it must be noted that slavery was prevalent in all of the colonies, North and South, until after the Revolutionary War. After the war, many northern colonies enacted laws to free slaves after the Revolutionary War. The economy of the South was agricultural based, with its extremely profitable crops of tobacco, wheat, rice, cotton, and sugarcane. So it depended heavily on slave labor. Part 3, life in the land of the free. Hell on earth. Thomas Jefferson. Everybody ever heard of him? An author of the Declaration of Independence, penner of the phrase, all men are created equal. Third president of the United States, owned 600 slaves in his lifetime. In his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he had this to say about the Negro. Blacks lack forethought, intelligence, tenderness, grief, imagination, and beauty. They have poor taste and they smell bad. Yeah, that's what he said. Well, Mr. Jefferson, how much forethought would you have if you had nothing to look forward to each day? How intelligent would you be if you had been deprived of the basic tools for learning? How pretty would you be? And how bad would you smell if you were forced to work from sunup to sundown and the same battered rags day in and day out? What's that? I can't hear you, sir. George Washington, another founding father, would own 317 slaves. Both men privately cursed slavery, but neither chose to free their slaves or any other slaves in their lifetime. The wealth that slave ownership provided overshadowed any moral convictions they may have had. Thomas Jefferson said this about a friend that fell into financial trouble. He should have invested in slaves. Washington put in his will that all his slaves be freed upon his death. Jefferson freed 5 slaves at his death. His concubines' relatives. Anybody ever heard of Sally Hemings? That's who he freed. The others were auctioned off and separated. The treatment of the African slave under the chattel slavery system was the most brutal in the history of mankind. The word chattel means personal property. It can be sold, traded, or given away as the owner pleases. A slave and its descendants were slaves for life. Oftentimes, slaves were branded with hot irons, mutilated, whipped until the flesh peeled from their backs, placed in hot boxes for days as punishment, most of the time for some petty misconduct, to show dominance or just for some sadistic satisfaction. Women were often sexually abused. Some slave owners would even have their children beat the slave as training for their future ownership. Yeah. The European descended slave owners, like their ancestors, looked upon the African slave as being subhuman, and therefore their treatment of them was not inhumane. These highly civilized Christians enslaved and brutalized millions of people because of racism, ignorance, and greed. They considered Africans to be a slave race created to serve them. That's what they said. The treatment of slaves varied by time period, region, and owner. Some historians believe that slaves on small farms may have lived a less brutal life due to the closer relationship they had with their slave owner. Not all slave owners were cruel. Some treated their slaves as humanely as possible. Some were taught to read and write, and some were given their freedom at some point. Not all whites were slave owners or racists. Many provided safe houses for runaway slaves. Former slave Josiah Henson had this to say about his slave life. Our dress was of toe cloth, a pair of coarse shoes once a year. We lodged in log huts. Wooden floors were an unknown luxury. In a single room were huddled like cattle 10 or a dozen persons, men, women, and children. There were neither bedsteads nor furniture. Our beds were collections of straw and old rags. The wind whistled, and the rain and snow blew in through the cracks, and the damp earth soaked in the moisture till the floor was miry as a pigsty. Livestock in the barn had better conditions. William Wells Brown, an escaped slave, said this: on one plantation, slave men were required to pick 80 pounds of cotton per day, while women were required to pick 70 pounds per day. If any slave failed in the quota, they were subjected to whiplashes for each pound they were short. Now, Broadway, 80 pounds don't sound like much to some of us who pick cotton. But you got to understand that the cotton back then wasn't like this hybrid fluffy stuff we have right now. It was those little short nap cotton. So 80 pounds probably was a lot. There was generally a hierarchy on the large plantations. House servants received the best treatment, skilled workers were next in line, and field hands were last in line. This often led to resentment and envy among the slaves, which owners relished because it formed divisiveness that they hoped would prevent them from unifying in a revolt. The 15-letter words. Authoritarian system of the slave owners did not guarantee total obedience, control, and dominance. There was an ongoing battle of wills between the owner and the slaves. The enslaved were just determined to resist. And that just was all of the time. They used different tactics. They were constantly putting up resistance. They would fake illness or injury, stage work slowdowns, and sabotage equipment. They developed unique communication systems of code words and body language. A slave uprising was a slave owner's worst nightmare, and there were many. The uprising led by Nat Turner, where 50 black men killed 50 white people in 2 days, terrified them the most. The slave owners were vastly outnumbered, and state governments and slave owners had enacted slave codes from day one in an effort to restrict the slaves' freedoms and to prevent revolts. A few examples of many were they couldn't be off the plantation alone, they couldn't congregate, they couldn't own weapons, of course, they couldn't learn to read or write. Punishment for a violation ranged from a beating to hanging. Slave codes differed by region. Louisiana, with its Spanish and French influence, had its code Noir or black codes. A few of them were, they required slave owners to instruct slaves in the Catholic religion. They allowed slaves to marry. They did not allow, they did not allow the separation of husband and wife by sale. They did not allow the sale of a child less than 14 years of age from its mother. These rights were unheard of in most other slave states. They would, a child belonged to the slave owner, didn't belong to the mama. So they oftentimes got sold away from the mother and so forth. A lot of times they would use that as leverage too, to get the slave to do whatever it was they wanted. You know, threaten them they're going to sell the child or something. A damning image of the white Southern belle is that many were slave owners. In her book, They Were Her Property, history professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers writes that the 1850 and 1860 censuses show that 40% of all slave owners were white women. Slaveholding parents often gifted their daughters slaves instead of land because slaves were more worth more at that time. Another eye-opening fact, all slave owners weren't white. In his book, Black Slave Owners, Larry Koger stated that there were 3,700 black slave owners in 1860. One in particular was Madame Cyprien Ricard and her son Pierre of Iberville, Louisiana. They owned 168 slaves. The majority of black slave owners were mulattoes. A mulatto is the offspring of a white parent and a black parent. Because of their light complexion and straighter hair, they were generally looked upon and treated more fairly than their darker-skinned, kinky-haired race mates. This no doubt made them feel like they were a class above. The word mulatto is a form of the word mula, M-U-L-A, which is Spanish for mule. A mule is the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse, and it is considered to be a hybrid. Two hybrids don't generally reproduce. Consequently, the offspring of a white parent and a black parent was called a mulatto, a hybrid that was believed unable to reproduce. Let's just show you how ignorant they were back in those days. Slaves were the most valued commodity of commerce at the time, and everyone wanted this goose that laid golden eggs, black and white. Free labor, basically no burden or overhead to produce money-making crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane. The work on sugarcane plantations and in the sugarcane mills was so harsh and dangerous that a slave's life expectancy was only 7 to 9 years performing that work. The slaves would generally work 16 to 20 hours a day because sugarcane because once sugar cane was cut, it had to be processed within 24 hours to preserve the sucrose. Many would die in the mill by being crushed under the large pressing wheels or by falling into the vats of hot liquid. All slaves weren't field hands. Slaves were worked wherever labor was needed. Many worked in factories in the north, on ships, in stores, cutting timber, etc. Some were highly skilled craftsmen that built furniture, wagons, and all types of metal work. Anybody ever heard of Nathan Green? Nathan Green was a slave owned by a man by the name of Dan Call. Dan Call was a grocery store owner, preacher, / moonshiner. Yeah, Nathan Nearest Green was his slave, and he developed a process for distilling whiskey. And once he was freed, a young man by the name of Jasper Daniels came to work for Mr. Carl. And Mr. Nathan Green showed him how to distill that whiskey. You ever heard of Jack Daniels whiskey? He's the man that made Jack Daniels whiskey famous. Nathan Green, former slave. Slavery was protested against from its beginning in America, mostly in the northern colonies, where it was not as important for the economy. Abolitionists used various tactics to end it. They used the press to reach the masses and gave speeches condemning it. But slavery was tightly woven into the fabric of the Southern culture and economy. Now, in all fairness to the Catholic Church, it must be noted that the Protestant Church wasn't very active in the abolitionist movement until the last few decades of its existence. Many used the curse of Noah on Canaan to justify it. That's in Genesis 9:25. You want to look it up. J. Daniel Hayes, professor of biblical studies at Ouachita Baptist University, wrote an interesting article you may want to read also. It's titled, "What Does the Bible Say About Race?" What does the Bible say about race? You can search that title and click on the abu.edu site. The Underground Railroad was a huge thorn in the side of the slavers. And of course, we all know about the most famous conductor, who was Harriet Tubman, who helped many slaves escape to freedom. Another route you may not know about was chronicled in the book South to Freedom by Alice L. Baumgartner. She writes about a little-known route to freedom to East Texas, which was a territory of Mexico at the time. And Mexico had abolished slavery in the 1820s. She states that thousands of slaves escaped to this territory from like Louisiana, Mississippi, so they just went west to Texas. In 1808, President Thomas Jefferson signed into law the act prohibiting importation of slaves. This was intended to stop the import of new slaves from Africa, but had no effect on the internal slave trade, which was flourishing. That's how we got to be 10 million. The slave population was almost 2 million in 1810 and rapidly increasing through the high birth rate. And some slave owners had even initiated breeding programs to supplement their needs and to sell. Just like a stud farm. Part 4. Emancipation. Free at last. Sort of. During and after the War for Independence, many began to question the hypocrisy of fighting for their freedom while depriving others of theirs. 5,000 to 8,000 people of African descent fought in the Revolutionary War. Vermont would be the first to abolish slavery in 1777, and all other northern colonies by 1804. Following the Revolutionary War, the freedmen's population in the North grew to almost 300,000. The prevailing view was that free people of color could not integrate into the white society. White slave owners also feared that these free black people might help their slaves to escape or rebel. This fear prompted the slave owners and the government in 1866 to create what was called the American Colonization Society. Its purpose was to repatriate free black people to Africa or Haiti and to remove the threat of rebellion. If they could no longer be lesser beings subjected to ownership, they were not wanted as fellow Americans with equal citizenship. The black community, as well as the white abolitionists, opposed the project. The freed Africans were born in America, and their sentiment was that they were no more African than the white Americans were British. That caused me to think about being designated or relegated to African America. That infers that I'm an African living in America with American citizenship. I'm not. I'm an American of African descent. That's what I am. You don't call them European Americans, do you? Why I got to be called an African American? I wasn't born in Africa, never been to Africa. Between 1821 and 1847, only a few thousand had immigrated to what would become Liberia, Africa. This experiment created all sorts of issues, from the language barrier to death from diseases native to Africa. The election of Abraham Lincoln, an anti-slavery Republican, to the presidency, and the constant agitation of the abolitionists caused the slave states to secede from the Union. The Republican Party was the advocate of the Negro until it and the Democratic Party switched ideologies sometime between the 1930s and 1960s. So back then, the Republican Party was the party for the Negro. Lincoln had anti-slavery views and opposed its expansion, but his primary goal in the Civil War was the preservation of the Union. He once said that if he could preserve the Union without freeing the slaves, then he would do so. He did not believe that whites would ever accept the Negro on an equal basis. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves. Some believe that the issuance of the proclamation was purely a tactic to cause chaos and to reduce the Confederacy's ability to wage war. The slaves' actual freedom wasn't realized until the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, which constitutionally abolished slavery. During the Civil War, a total of 618,222 soldiers died, with 1.5 million casualties. 186,000 Negroes joined the Union Army, and 19,000 joined the Navy. About 38,000 lost their lives. The death toll of the Civil War exceeded that of World War I and World War II combined. People of African descent have served, died, and distinguished themselves with bravery and honor in every conflict America has been in. When it was certain that the Union had won the war, a meeting was held with the whites and blacks in leadership roles. White leaders posed the question of what to do with the 4 million freed slaves. Frederick Douglass, who was in attendance, stated, "Do nothing with them. Your doing with them is their greatest misfortune." Well, for all practical purposes, nothing meaningful was done with them or for them. 4 million homeless lambs left for the slaughter. They didn't know how to be independent and fend for themselves. Out there among a whole bunch of mad white folks. The war had left the infrastructure and economy of the South in shambles. Lincoln had some preliminary plans to aid the freed slaves in their new life, but he was assassinated before they could be implemented. One plan was the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was to provide relief to the freed slaves and the displaced Southerners. It was poorly staffed and underfunded. It was a dismal failure and was forced to close in 1872. Another plan was Field Order 15, the 40 acres and a mule promise. Yeah. This was to provide the freed slaves with land that was confiscated from the Southern slave owners. His vice president and successor, Andrew Johnson, rescinded Field Order 15 and returned the confiscated land back to its pre-war owners. Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee and obviously pro-Southern. Lincoln had also proposed strict requirements for the readmission of the Southern states to the Union in his Reconstruction plan. Johnson rescinded those as well and gave the Southern states free rein to rebuild their governments as they pleased under his Reconstruction plan. As a result of Johnson's leniency, the Southern states basically reverted back to their pre-war slave state status. Although the Negro was technically free, the former slave states did all they could to restrict and limit his freedom. This included enacting many black codes, which still allowed them control over the former slaves' lives. The Negro was required to have written evidence of employment for the upcoming year. They could only work as farm labor or servants unless they paid an annual tax of between $10 and $100. They were penalized for vagrancy with forced plantation labor. If convicted of the so-called vagrancy law, which is a loophole in the 13th Amendment, that could subject them to involuntary servitude or another form of slavery. These restrictions forced many freed slaves back to the plantations and farms as sharecroppers, where they were often cheated out of their share of profits just so that they could have food and shelter. Treatment and conditions in the North were not a whole lot better. The black codes were enforced by all white police and state militia that was often made up of Confederate veterans. The 14th Amendment passed in 1868 and granted citizenship to the Negro. The 15th Amendment passed in 1870 and granted voting rights to black men. Some Southern blacks would win elections to Southern state government and even to the U.S. Congress during the Reconstruction era. By 1877, when the last federal troops left the South and Reconstruction ended, the Negro had seen little improvement in their economic and social status. The vigorous efforts of white supremacy groups had undone the political gains that they had made. Although freed from legalized slavery in 1865, the Negro would still be subjected to almost the same abusive treatments for another 100 years. It wasn't until 1965, during the Civil Rights Movement and the passing of the Voting Rights Act, that some relief was afforded. Most, if not all of us, had early ancestors who lived a slave life. Our ancestors were a strong, resilient, God-fearing people. That is what enabled them to persevere and survive. Knowing the story of their lives gives us a greater understanding and sense of identity as to the people we really are, as opposed to the people we are said to be. The history of our race and our family is worth knowing about and preserving. If anyone desires to research their ancestry, I'll be more than glad to help you get started. I hope no bitterness comes to your heart because of anything you've heard in this presentation. I believe that nothing happens that God doesn't allow, and that everything that happens serves a purpose. If there's any vengeance to be had, it is His. Thanks for your attendance. Are there any questions or comments? Okay.
Okay, so my comment is, ironically, you stated the comments that Thomas Jefferson had about slaves, which Sally Hemings, one of the ones that he emancipated, she was actually gifted to him because she was the half sister of Martha, his wife, and so he had 6 children by her. And so I wanted, that was the one comment that I wanted. So it was interesting he had that comment. However, he had so many, children by Sally. The other comment, did you say that from a ship that came in 1619 to Hampton, Virginia, had about 20 slaves, but from that slave ship, they had resulted in how many African American?
The scholar said that from 20 and up, after I mean 22, 23 or whatever, the population of African slaves in this country grew to 10 million.
10 million, that's what I thought.
From that 20 and up, through, but what I said was through importation and childbirth.
And childbirth.
Some of them were imported, of course, 388 were imported. So if you want to do the math, I guess you could say 388 plus 20 and odd, whatever that number came up to be, and the remainder of the 10 million were actually born in America.
Okay, and I guess I got one more question, I'm sorry. So, you know how now we say we are not, and you touched on this, you do not consider yourself African American? You say you are American?
I would prefer to be called American of African descent.
Okay, okay. I understand.
Because to me, just call me an African American is to infer that I'm African.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or that I came from Africa. And I didn't, just like those people did back then.
Yeah.
I'm not African. I didn't, never been to Africa. Wasn't born in Africa. So if you're going to call me something, call me an American of African descent. I don't have a problem with that because that's what I am. So, but I mean, people call you call yourself whatever you want to call you. I'm just saying what I would prefer to be called. Because as I said, they're not called Americans of European descent. Why? No more. The only true Americans are Native Americans. Thank you.
Well, I'm just saying, this book is called
Love and Whiskey. Oh, wow.
Okay, Love and Whiskey. And it talks about the remarkable story, true story of Jack Daniel. But this book was written by Fawn Weaver. Now, she talks about, this is a lady, CEO of Uncle Nearest Incorporated, the first black American woman to found and lead a company valued more than $1 billion. But this, what I wanted to make known was, Weaver didn't want to use green, this black, to promote whiskey. Rather, she wanted to use whiskey to promote green. And the idea that enslaved black people were also a part of the story. So I want to give this book to Mr. Reitzell.
Thanks, ma'am. Thank you. And another thing.
And I want to make note that it was signed. That's it. But I had two of the copies. I don't know why I get on this. I sit off to get it autographed.
Yeah. And like so many other black people, Nearest Green didn't get his recognition for that until 2019, 6 years ago. He finally got recognized as the man who made Jack Daniel's whiskey famous. His process was, he distilled it through a sugar maple. Yeah. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Anybody? Oh, go ahead. Yes, I did. Oh, a lot of them. I can tell you this. Excuse me. And the reason I did, I like a lot of people, I was averse to doing it. I don't want to have my DNA. But the only way I could find out who one of my great grandparents was through DNA. He's a white man. And Nobody could tell me, and it had always been said that he was a white man, but nobody had any documentation. And I talked to a lot of people, a lot of the white Reitzell. They didn't know anything. So it was important to me and my family to know this. So I said, I'm going to do the DNA test. Because I know that if I do that, and I find somebody out there, one of those of European descent, that I share DNA with, then that tells me what I'm looking for. And so that's why I did it. And sure enough, when I got my results back, I said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm only going to weed through all of these people, because they'll send me like thousands of people who you share DNA with. I'm only going to look at the ones who have European DNA. European, white. And so that's what I did. So I messaged them, told them who I was, and asked them, I said, are there any Reitzells in your family, da-da-da-da-da. One guy messaged me back. He wasn't a Reitzell. He messaged me back. He said, yes. He said, as a matter of fact, there is. He said, my mother is a Reitzell. And I knew he was white because he had his picture in there. Lived in Hawaii. He said, as a matter of fact, yes, my mother is a Reitzell. And her daddy is named Doxy Reitzell. Doxy Reitzell is the brother of Dick Reitzell, right here in Monroe. They are the grandkids of William Bowen Reitzell, the man who was said to be my great-grandfather. So, that's how I found out. Once I found that out, got him. Now, once he found out that I was black, he didn't want to talk to me no more. But that's okay. I found out what I needed to know. So my DNA is 25% European DNA. And that European goes like Germany, hence the name Reitzell, Wales, England, and all the European countries. And the rest of it is African countries. Ghana, Nigeria. They give you a certain percentage of where your DNA it comes from. I doubt it. I doubt if your daddy came up from, huh? Census?
But I don't understand.
Okay. What's your daddy's name? You know about when he was born and where? Okay, you let me know and I'll look it up for you. Because if you know a name pretty close to where what year they were born and where they were born, you put it in there, yeah, and it'll bring them up. Because as I said earlier, most people are on a census report somewhere. The only problem is a lot of times the names are misspelled and all that, because a lot of those census takers were just as illiterate as the people who were, they were. No, that he didn't want. Well, he didn't say it. It's just that we had messaged each other 2 or 3 times, and then somewhere along the line, I guess I must have let him know that I was black. And after that, he didn't want. We didn't communicate anymore. But I don't care. You know, I found out what I needed to know. If he never talked to me again. And if he's that way, I don't want to talk to him again. So, oh yeah.
Trying to find their genealogy. And there's some kind of way they got in touch with my nephew. And they sent pictures, he was a white guy, pictures and all this information. And so my nephew, maybe a shade too dark than me, sent a lot of information back, sent his picture back. They had a at anything.
Well, and you know, the name, a lot of times they'll go by names, but you can't go by a name because, I mean, they're probably a Billion Smith, Jones, and all this kind of stuff. The other thing, though, you have to understand is that black people are all over the place, African people, because of that slave trade and all that kind of stuff, all up in Europe. I was reading somewhere the other day where Lisbon, Portugal, 40% of its population is African descent, 40%. And of course, Portugal is the one that started the Atlantic slave trade, but you know, you got slaves, Africans that went all of these different countries and everywhere, so it ain't surprising that a lot of people got African DNA in them, a lot of people got European DNA in them. It's just the way it is, you know. I mean, we all mongrels. So, yes, you can.